Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Ryan Cooper.
And I'm Alexi the Greek, and we're so excited to have Astra Taylor here with us today. Astra is a filmmaker, a writer, an author. I've watched her latest film, What is Democracy, now 3 times. It made me cry each time. And I'm so excited to talk about her new book, Democracy May Not Exist, But You'll Miss It When It's Gone, which is such a wonderful, thoughtful contribution to both political philosophy and political praxis. And so thank you for coming and joining us today, Astra. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so your book is so great because I feel like it is enacting that which it's discussing, which is it's attempting to help the polis, the people that are reading it, and also those that are watching your great film, figure out how to wrestle with what it means to do self-rule collectively, right? And you point out at the outset that this involves a lot of paradox, a lot of tensions that we have to kind of work through in this dynamic way. So, at what point did you realize that democracy, the concept, the history, the politics, is kind of imbricated with all these tensions and all these paradoxes?
Well, thank you for that. But I like what you just said, which is the book is about how to wrestle with. In other words, it's not about how to do it. And I think this is probably bad for like marketing or actually making a book that sells, right? Because there are so many books that are like rules for life, right? Or lessons for the 21st century, or, 3 ways to fix X, Y, or Z. And this book is like, no, this is like, let's wrestle some more. Let's add complications and think things through. Not in the way that's sort of solution driven, because, I think, hey, we're on Left Anchor, right? Like, we know as leftists a lot of political solutions or policies we'd like to see implemented. So instead, the projects are really about bringing political philosophy into the discussion, which I think is about sort of wrestling with things that don't have clear answers. So I was making the film, What is Democracy? I wrote the proposal for that in 2013. Was filming all the way until the election of Donald Trump, so, late 2016. And I was trying to, think about what the sort of ordering principles of it were. And I don't know, I was driving, and I was like, okay, paradoxes. This is actually what I'm getting at, because I'm trying to inhabit that irresolvable space. And I was doing that in a way selfishly, because what I was wondering is, like, why is democracy so fucking hard to do, right?
Yeah.
Like, it is a pain in the ass. And, as a lefty, this isn't something that only lefties have as a trait, but, I can be pretty, like, self-righteous and smug and think I know what's right and how things should be. And yet when you get in a group and you try to do it, like, the meeting goes off the rails, or actually it turns out that your theory doesn't have all of these other layers of nuance or detail that you need. And so the book is arranged explicitly as paradoxes. The paradoxes are implicit in the film because the film needs to live as a piece of art where you can empathize with the characters. The book, I'm allowed to be more analytical and sort of give my framework away. And so, what I say in the introduction is I'm not talking about a Marxist contradiction, right? So Marx, I think, really, was onto something when he said there are these contradictions that are central to capitalism, like the divide between, capital and labor, or, commonwealth and private property, and that, these things are going to clash, and there could be an economy where they're resolved. He called that communism, right? It's like where there aren't some a handful of rich people and masses of poor people. But what I'm getting at is like something different, which is, democracy, part of why democracy is so difficult is because it has these tensions that won't resolve even under some perfect democratic communist utopia, right? So we'll always have to have this tension between how to live in the present and how to plan for the future, how to weigh, expertise with mass opinion, because not everyone can be an expert at everything, how to balance choice with coercion, when is coercion legitimate in a society where people self-govern. So the book is me working through these tensions, and saying democracy, it's not something we just have. It's this process of always thinking these things through. And, hopefully the conditions under which we're thinking get better and more just. But
For sure.
These problems aren't going away.
I had just a prefatory question about the Canadian Board of Film. Is that what it's called?
And I was
the
just
National
very
Film
curious.
Board of Canada.
Yes, right. Good old Canada. And I just can as a uncultured American swine, I was just like, what? The government's funding lefty propaganda? Like, what is this madness? So can you explain what that is and like how it works?
The National Film Board of Canada is unique in the world. So I should begin by saying I'm Canadian, and only in the last year have I officially become American. I claimed my citizenship at long last, but I'm a Canadian who grew up in the American South, in the other Athens, Georgia.
Oh, wow.
But Canada has a wonderful history of investing in documentary film, actually. And the National Film Board of Canada is unique in the world in that it supports the creation of director-driven feature-length documentaries. So it's not attached to broadcast. So it's not something that has to fit into the mold of television or, now whatever it would be, digital series, but freestanding documentaries, and they support the project from inception all the way through distribution. But they have a history of doing very interesting political films. And I think part of why I ended up where I am is that as a young person, I'm talking as a teenager, I watched a film about Noam Chomsky. Manufacturing Consent, it's called, right? It's this 3-hour epic. National Film Board of Canada produced this film.
Awesome.
Right?
Wow.
And so it's quite interesting because people occasionally in a Q&A will be like, oh, did you not touch on some issue because you were censored by the government? And I'm like, oh no, you do not understand the Canadians. Their advice to me creatively was, what sets your film apart is that it's philosophical. There was a lot of news-driven social issue documentaries. So go with the philosophy, do what it is that you do that's unique. And this is a film that I'm absolutely certain could not be made in the American context because the American context is market-driven. So it's sort of like what will get the most clicks, what will be the biggest at the box office. And it's philanthropy funded, which means what does the current crop of billionaires, who are in the film space, what are their interests? What's the trendy thing for a billionaire executive producer to make a film about? And in late 2013, when I pitched this film, it definitely wasn't democracy, and it wouldn't be, democracy from the angle I'm getting at it from. So I definitely would not have made this film if it wasn't for the state support that this institution allows. And I think it really gives the lie to this idea that, state-supported culture is just going to be this lowest common denominator,
Right.
pablum, right, which is sort of the cliche. Which is really an interesting thing to encounter in the United States because what it forgets is that actually why funding for the arts in America is controversial goes back to the NEA4, the National Endowments for the Arts, and why that funding was controversial was that actually the artists were making work that was too edgy, not because it was bland.
No,
so
that's
there's
right.
something
Because
state support gives artists a certain freedom to work outside the market that can be really liberating.
I'm so glad that the Canadians exist for that purpose. Hopefully one day, we might also embrace that ethos in our state-funded activities, right?
It actually did remind me, though, it was back during New Deal days, they had a bunch, part of the Works Progress Administration, I believe, was funding artists to paint murals and stuff.
Absolutely.
They hired Woody Guthrie to tour all the big dams that they were building, and he was writing songs about hydroelectric power and whatnot. And
I have a little history tidbit about that. I wrote a piece recently for the Baffler magazine, and I think it's called "Envisioning the People." I can't remember the name of my own article because you write the article, but you never title your own piece.
You're
right?
not in charge of that.
But it's about how the people have been visualized. So how do you actually represent the people? And so I talk about some of the New Deal era murals and how radical they were, very political and controversial. But one historical fact I couldn't get in there is actually the person who first had the idea that the state should fund the arts was actually the teenage daughter of Frances Perkins, who's the first female cabinet secretary in the history of the U.S. She's was this radical labor secretary who pushed a lot of the social policies that we value from that period. And her her teenage daughter loved arts and was like, well, hold on, why can't the artists be part of this process too? They could make our world more beautiful. And Frances Perkins took that idea to FDR. So we have a teenage girl to thank for that history.
Absolutely. And I think both the documentary and your book, which talks about it, shows that it's simple prejudice to think that either the young or the old or the rich or the poor have any exclusive rights to wisdom or insight or anything else. And that, people are people, and it can arise, like liberatory, emancipatory politics and insight into human nature can arise from, the teenage daughter that had that idea, or just people that you interview on the street. It must have been really interesting to talk to professors and then people from different countries and different nations in this moment to, I assume, discover that human beings all have these capacities and potentials in them. And maybe that says a lot about the potential for democracy.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because actually, so right before you all called me, I was looking at the election results from Europe, right, and thinking about the people who voted for the Brexit Party and the fact that Farage is like, right now he's like gloating about the results. And there's this part of me, right, like anyone who's like, God damn it, people, you're so,
Yeah, frustrating, so frustrating.
Driving me crazy. Yeah. And I think what was interesting about, going through the process of making this film and then writing this book is that a documentary, like making a documentary, it forced me to go out and talk to strangers and engage in, sure, it wasn't like disciplined social science research, but I talked to a lot of people. And what I found was that people do have a lot of wisdom. And, we live in a society that excludes that wisdom and that doesn't facilitate that wisdom or really appreciate it. And so, the film, I tried to not portray people in an overly idealized light. I try to show the people in their ugliness and their complexity. But I do think that so many of the most valuable ideas and the best aspects of democracy, came from people who, weren't in positions of power, who weren't highly credentialed. And so the film is making a case for a democratization of our conception of who counts as an expert. So my mantra making the film was, okay, I'm going to approach every single person like they're a philosopher and talk to them in this way that takes them seriously and engages them on the level of ideas. And then in the book, I try to continue that by placing the insights from the people I met next to the sort of usual suspects, right? Madison and Jefferson and Marx and then suddenly you're talking to someone who's, a formerly incarcerated barber. and that's the thing about democracy that's risky about it, right? Is that there should be no threshold for participation. Right, it's not a meritocracy, or there is a word for this. I always forget the word for it. A society where like only the educated can vote.
Epistocracy.
Yes, epistocracy. Right. And no, I'm trying to make the case that no, there's all sorts of insight that is valuable. And I think the question I'm implicitly posing is, well, who knows the most about how our world runs, how it operates and its injustices, right? The people who occupy society's bottom rungs and who are experiencing, mass incarceration from the inside, or someone who has a kind of theoretical understanding of, what the law should be, but never lives up to.
Oh, and very often the people that don't understand are often being conditioned by capitalism in a way to just accept. You brought up Gramsci in your book, and it is a wonderful juxtaposition that you have with your interviewees and the thinkers you draw in. But the hegemonic thinking that just pervades that if there isn't the kind of educating that comes through talking to each other and organizing, there is this kind of, it's like the water you breathe. You just assume that capitalism, right, will always exist and the values it espouses are the right ones. And so often that's the problem. Not that somebody hasn't had a certain formal education, but yeah, so people are always educated. It's just a matter of what forces or people are doing it, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I begin the book, because the book is an exploration of democracy's paradoxes with the most famous paradox of all, Rousseau's paradox, the founding paradox, which is, distilled is essentially, well, how do you make a democratic people out of an undemocratic people, right? So if we've been conditioned by capitalism, which is an economic system that concentrates wealth and power and encourages competition and, wants rule by the market as opposed to like popular deliberation, then how do we break that, So we can break it by organizing, by trying to enact democracy in our relationships, at our workplaces, by expanding our conception of democracy beyond the ballot box. But I think there's another paradox that just kind of only gets said implicitly later in the book, and it's the inverse of, I think the inverse of Rousseau's paradox is also at work, and it's how elites view things, and it's essentially, well, how do you create an undemocratic people out of a democratically spirited people, right? Because, and that's what our system does, right? When it makes it actually extremely difficult to do something as simple as voting, right? So people have to register, and then they have to skip a day's work, and it's like actually there are all of these systems that make basic participation a challenge. And so, to go back to your first question about just talking to people on the street, I mean, I think initially I would ask people, okay, what is democracy? And people would be a little flustered, like they wouldn't have a definition on hand that satisfied them or was particularly deep or personally meaningful. But then once I started engaging them, I realized like, oh, they actually have a lot of thoughts. They actually have, a political life. It's just that it hasn't, it's not encouraged, and there are very few forums through which people actually practice democracy in their day-to-day lives. And, political philosophy is something that few people get to actually engage with directly. I mean, instead we just are subjected to the news, or maybe we get to study it in school. So, in the end, I would say that making these projects has made me more committed to the idea of democracy, even on days like today when bad news is coming in.
In your book and especially in the documentary, you sort of frame all the little sections around quotes from Plato, who is kind of notoriously skeptical of democracy, and you say that you point out that Plato, one of the things he says, democracy inevitably leads to tyranny because you get a demagogue who plays on the passions of the lumpen proletariat or whatever, and that seems pretty much like the Trump base. But on the other hand, you also say that Plato has been kind of misunderstood, and that he's maybe not quite as much of an aristocrat as people might think. So can you dig into that a little bit? What you've learned from thinking about Plato and democracy in modern context?
Yeah, I'm soft on Plato. I mean, it's so true. I mean, it's not just Plato was skeptical of democracy. I mean, Plato hated democracy, right? I mean, and he hated democracy because democracy put his teacher, his icon, his guru, Socrates, to death. Right, and he was also writing in the period of sort of democratic decline. I mean, he had his reasons, but I think one thing though you glean from reading the dialogues, Plato's dialogues, though, is that the very form of them kind of subverts his anti-democratic claims, because it's about people deliberating. It's about, sort of Socrates, this gadfly, being in the street and talking to strangers and engaging them in this philosophical inquiry. So I think Plato's texts are complicated and really interesting. I also think when we read texts from the past, it's not fair to go to those texts and say, hey, if this text doesn't solve my problems or, affirm my sensibilities, then it's not valuable, right? It's like, well, why was Plato asking the questions he's asking? And the Republic is a really interesting text because it's dealing with, again, this period of decline. And so the cliche reading of the Republic, what people remember is, Plato wanted a philosopher king because, of course, he's a philosopher. So therefore, it's like this narcissism, right? But it's more complicated than that. As you just said, he's making the argument that democracy devolves into tyranny because of the problem of oligarchy, because of the divide between the rich and the poor, which creates conditions for these demagogues to come and play on the passions of the people and to say, hey, I'll make your lives better. And his solutions have to do with creating a class of rulers who are both male and female. He's very clear on this, that there can be philosopher kings and queens. They're a sort of guardian class that are indigent and propertyless, and therefore they rule for the good of the community. And so Plato's problem with democracy wasn't that it, wasn't that he just didn't like the people. It's that he thought the system marginalized the wise. So I think there's just an interesting parable in there, right? This parable of decline and, again, it also kind of challenges those of us who are focused on capitalism, because what it shows, ancient Athens was a slave state. It wasn't capitalism as we know it, but you still have this problem of inequality breaking the city in two. And so, it's something, he was prescient. He's not, a psychic or something. He's not giving us some lesson from history that just repeats itself, but it's something to sort of think with and think through. And so, I play with it in the film as a kind of motif, because also I think, but to go back to one thing I just hinted at, partly it's because, I think as we make social progress, we shouldn't flatter ourselves so much, right? Like for me, there's still something about Plato that's worth going back to and learning from, just like it's worth it to go back and learn from Rousseau. And so the movie is also me trying to say, I can learn from these sort of, giants of political philosophy and put them in conversation with teenage kids from Miami, or with refugees, or with trauma surgeons, and sort of read these texts in a way that I think gives them new life and new relevance, because we need to learn from everything that we can in this moment. So Plato becomes something, he's also, there's a more banal reason though, that I'm going to confess to. And it's that, Plato, he represents the beginning of Western political philosophy. Like that is the foundational text, right? It's this wonderful founding text. But to the viewer of the film, he also just signifies like old times, right? Because we're so stuck in the now, everything is like the latest tweet, the viral outrage. And so in the film is trying to be more timeless than that. And so there's this moment where actually when Plato comes on screen, where it's actually just, there's a sort of poetic fragment, and it's like, take a different viewpoint, step back, get a more meta perspective. So he's also useful to me in that way, like, because he symbolizes the ancient.
Right. No, and that's beautiful. And not just because I'm Greek, partly because I'm Greek, but also it's beautiful because, like you said, people are so, the presentism is crazy, but also there's no possibility. Everything's impossible. Everyone knows everything. And the timelessness, which again, paradoxically is seen through looking at history, shows all the different possibilities that have occurred and that might occur again. And you truly are a political philosopher in the sense that you want to keep changing the way that people see things and rethink things and open up possibility in both theory and praxis, which is beautiful and wonderful. By the way, I loved the translations that you had. I hadn't seen those translations before of the text. How did, and maybe this is just a selfish thing, but how did you do those translations?
So I have to say, this is where I'm like, I am not a scholar. So what I did was I got every translation I could find and sort of knew the quotes that I wanted, and then sort of laid every translation out, and then gave myself the freedom to mix and match.
You did it. You translated
right?
That.
Yes.
Awesome.
Because I just think it was, I could have religiously stuck to the Jowlet or some classic translation, but I'm working in a vernacular and wanted that moment. The moment where I knew that Plato also had to be central was when I was filming at Piraeus Port, at the peak of the refugee crisis, right? So I'm there before the EU-Turkey deal went through, and that is the site, literally the site of the Republic, right? So you have this, image of Socrates in that space, and what the film comes home to that space, 2,500 years later. And it's still this site of democratic contestation, transformation, and encounter, right? And so that's, again, history doesn't repeat itself, and you can't, look to these ancient texts and just sort of apply them in this straightforward way. And yet here we are still, we're living through something analogous, right? And this space is still a space of democracy. So that was when it was like, okay, this is all coming full circle.
Yeah, I remember I went to Reed College, and they make you take a great books class. You got to read Plato.
I thought I wanted to go to Reed College.
It's a pretty good school. I mean,
it seemed like the place to be, and I wasn't there.
It's like any of those liberal arts schools, but there's a lot of them. I think that they do that. It's you got to take the different types of things, get a well-rounded education, whatever that means. But everyone's got to take Hume 110 and it's great books. A lot of dead white guys, but they try to make it somewhat more inclusive. But something that stuck with me ever since was one of the first, so you have lectures and then you have like a discussion, whatever you call it, section with 8 or 10 people, and one of the professors, and she said, towards the beginning when we were having like a kind of classic lefty, point out the obvious stuff. Oh yes, Thucydides is a misogynist or whatever. That like it's very easy to point out things that are wrong about something, especially when you're writing, 2,500 years after the fact. But what is more difficult and more interesting and more rewarding is to try to figure out how they might be right, even if it's perhaps especially if you disagree with their conclusions, because these are smart folks, and I think, as you say, it's always worth investigating. These thinkers and trying to figure out what relevance they may have.
Well, it's interesting because also, I mean, when you say it's that the canon is dead white guys, I mean, Plato, there wasn't a conception of race when the Greeks were writing, right? I mean, this is a later invention. And I mean, I think for me, I'm very attuned to the politics of citations. I mean, I recently read a book, this is work of philosophy about democratic socialism, and I won't name it, but I just couldn't believe that it like basically didn't cite a single woman, and
wow.
And for me, I just feel that as a woman, I know we can think. I know there have been interesting women throughout history, and so it's this, it's sort of this this approach of like, yes, I don't have to write things out, but let's read them in juxtaposition with other texts. Let's hear them with other voices, and so the film is, for a film about philosophy, for a film about politics, there's a lot of women in the film. There's a lot of, there are young women, there are old women, and the same with the book. It's like, how can you present an image of democracy it's not that's politically correct, but that's more accurate, in its representations. And because I think those juxtapositions are fruitful and interesting, so, that means not just giving a kind of knee-jerk critique of the canon, but bringing it into dialogue with all of this amazing stuff that, hasn't been properly considered part of democratic theory and practice. I mean, and so I pointed this out in a book forum essay from the fall, which is, so many of the new books on the crisis of democracy, are all written by men, and you read them and they're all about democracy is this male business, and then maybe feminism kind of pops in, and like when the suffragettes are marching or something like that. And it's like, no, I'm trying to do something different. I don't quite have a word for it, but it's just like something that sees that these other voices are not just a sort of like garnish we add at the end of the story.
Right. It was brilliant and wonderful and beautiful to read and see Angela Davis, Wendy Brown, brilliant Greek philosophers, academics that I didn't even know that are women, right? And then wonderful just individuals from the Syrian refugee. It was just like I said, it was thought-provoking, and I cried every time I saw the film, and just loved rereading about those brilliant insights. Like, you know, and I think that synthetic integral approach is so wonderful. And, you know, thank you for doing that. That's just...
I really appreciate that. That's really music to my ears, so thank you. Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, these Greek women philosophers that I found I almost felt like I conjured them, because I had this idea of an intellectual woman leading me around the ancient agora, leading me through the ruins. And with the help of a friend who was working as a research assistant, we literally, you know, we found her on the internet and had a Skype call. And I was like, I'm going to make you a star, you know? And because, because these are also people who I think I would have liked to see when I was younger, because this idea of, you know, thinkers who are people. I mean, I think part of what the film is also trying to do is to, challenge this idea that political philosophy is this rarefied thing, you know, or that intellectuals aren't regular people. So you see, for example, in this one character in the film, you know, she gives us the sort of history of the founding of ancient Athenian democracy, but then you also see the way the economic crisis in Greece is affecting her life and her family, and it's this thing of like nobody is unaffected by the political challenges of our time. Right? Nobody's just a sort of a head without a body who isn't going to be part of this broader, you know, political crisis. So the movie is trying to show political thinking as a sort of embodied personal.
Yeah, that on that note, I think in the book and the film, if I'm not mistaken, you talk for a while with a barber who was a prisoner, ex prisoner, and that, you know, on the topic of ordinary people routinely having like quite sophisticated understandings of how things are happening, you know, through some pretty, you know, grim experience. This guy really stood out. Can you talk a little bit, you know, how you found that guy and you know, what you think his experience illustrates about, you know, modern society?
Yeah. So there are some characters that are only in the film and some characters that are only in the book. You know, it's interesting who lived in each medium, because the mediums are really different. I mean, they're almost incompatible mediums. Like they don't use the same logic. They don't have the same level of emotion, or like film has this visceral quality that my type of writing doesn't. But Ellie Brett, who is the character referring to, he worked in both spaces, because I think what he said is so profound. So when he was young, around 20 years old, he committed a crime. He spent his 20s in lockup, and he did a lot of thinking and a lot of reading. And so in the film, as he sort of talks about his experiences and his ideas, what you get is this incredibly astute understanding. So again, to this question of, well, who's a philosopher and who's an expert, right? You know, is the expert on criminal justice, you know, the law enforcement officer or the policy person or the public defender, or is it the guy who's been there on the inside and seen the inequities, seen the differences of treatment between, you know, someone like him and a white collar criminal? But his analysis goes deeper than that, because what he sees is that the prison system, you know, not only does it punish people who are, you know, poor and black and brown, not only are there all of these inequities, but it's punitive in a way that's, I think, quite shocking by the end, because what he talks about is how he went on a hunger strike with others in the prison because the authorities were going to take the library away. Right. So this sort of gives the lie to this idea that prison is anything about rehabilitation or, you know, at all geared towards, you know, creating conditions under which prisoners could set themselves up to reintegrate into society, what you get is just the most sort of mean-spirited, dehumanizing action. Like, you don't even get to read. And so I think in that he just brings in, he also talks about how he worked essentially, for nothing, right? So no minimum wage laws. He worked for 40 cents a day, making the meat patties that then are fed to the children in the public schools. And so you see the way that the prison system is imbricated in, creating a sort of underclass of, not even like just like sub-wage laborers, the way it's tied to education or the lack thereof. So he's a really powerful, character. And so he comes in the book in the chapter that's about the tension between expertise and mass opinion, right? And the fact that democracy needs both of those. And so he's there as someone who, challenges who's an expert, but also looks at the fact that, people want to learn. I mean, if you look at the history of the working class, it's people desperate to have opportunities to engage with the life of the mind. And people have fought really hard for the right to do that. And it's been suppressed at every juncture, right? And so this image of someone taking the library away is just this very vivid example of a much larger historical trend.
Right. I think it's brilliant because it shows that I think understanding the role of freedom in democracy is understanding freedom, not just, as you put, not just the negative liberty of Isaiah Berlin, but of the civic kind of participation and republicanism of Rousseau, where if it was simply about mere domination, then there would be no need to remove the library, right? But removing the library signals that there's something emancipatory about people finding their way to educate themselves, right? And that it's a dangerous thing. The arts and education are dangerous because people can become as wise or wiser than those that have power and domination over them, and they can throw off that yoke because democracy is possible. That's why it's dangerous, right?
Yeah, and it is tied up in, I like that. I mean, it's like if it was just a way for people to pass the time, it would be fine. But there's this emancipatory quality, and that's why, I think it was in the news recently too that, prisoners were being banned from receiving books about the criminal justice system. So, there is this, it gets to, again, this sort of paradox of like, well, how do you create a democratic people out of an undemocratic people, or the reverse, right? How do you create an undemocratic people out of a democratic people? And, if you have people who, are saying, we want to learn, and then your response is taking away their access to that opportunity, then you're actively producing an undemocratic citizenry, right? A citizenry that is going to be, more ignorant and less engaged. And so, there are different aspects of that chapter, but I think it's really important to challenge this idea that comes up in sort of liberal discourse around democracy, which is like, oh, if we just had education, that's what we need to solve the problem of democracy. Yeah. We need more education. And it's like, well, hold on. Education to what end, and education for what? And also look at the history of how elites have denied people the opportunity to learn, and how working people and women have struggled for the opportunity, again, to live a life of the mind. So I think, I don't know, part of it is just, that's such a pat response to the crisis we're in. And it's something that really needs to be challenged, because of course it has a mode of truth, right? We need education for democracy, but it quickly spirals into this sort of like blame the teacherism that we see today too, where it's like teachers are poor public school teachers who are basically supposed to create jobs that don't exist by educating students correctly. They're also supposed to be like military force, like fighting off shooters. They're supposed to, remedy racial inequities. They're supposed to somehow teach kids who haven't been able to eat breakfast. So I think there's just something with that I just really wanted to push the argument further right?
And on the other hand, the students, the way that education is conducted has been twisted around as well, so that the only thing that people are concerned about as students are, can I get a job? That this is the ideology that's drilled into you. I remember this even at Reed College. I was a chemistry major because chemistry pays good money. And it probably would have if I had become a chemist, which I unfortunately did not. But yeah, as you say, the idea of education as creating citizens has been totally supplanted in the sort of internal ideology of the educational system as producing workers, and that I feel like is a pretty toxic development.
I remember we talked about Gramsci on an episode, and we saw in the New York Times Magazine a full-page ad for a company that I believe what they do is they make an arrangement with your employer so that part of your paycheck goes to paying off the student loan debt. And it had the image of a young college student who had a shirt on, and it had like a number like 68,769, which is obviously like her student debt. And the top said, why did she go to college? And then at the bottom it says, to work for you. And I was like, oh my God, this is like mask off. This is
like this person is this trapped, $68,000 trapped.
But like she was smiling. She's like, I went to college so I could get into debt to pay off my debt by you enacting this business to help me pay off the debt that I went into to work for you and be your wage slave. And I'm smiling about it. And that's what education is.
Yeah. Well, no. And I think this, and this really, I think it totally transforms. I mean, it's part of the neoliberal transformation, right? Is that instead of thinking of education as a sort of broadly exploratory experience, or okay, we're going to be well-rounded in the liberal arts, sort of like that time at Reed College, right? Okay, we're going to have some basic humanities and basic sciences. It's like, no, I need to specialize and make sure I get a return on investment. And so I think this is why so much of my organizing and my activist work is geared towards public education and around issues of student debt. But I think, I think I say this in the book, but, I don't think we know what a truly democratic educational system would look like. I mean, we sort of know what education looks like when it's geared towards industry. We know what education policy is like when we're kind of in a Cold War competitive dynamic and trying to build up our, human capital as a nation. We know what education is like under a neoliberal regime when people are trying to make themselves into successful entrepreneur students. But we don't really know what education in service of a different, again, this goes to your issue of your obsession with possibilities, right? Like, we don't know what would be possible. We don't know what education would look like if the priority actually were educating everyone to engage in some kind of self-rule, right? And without without making it so that it's just about sort of social control and, keeping people off the streets or making people good workers or or good debt payers.
Yeah, and that's why your book is so great, because it's an invitation to think anew what that might mean to live well together, right? That's as you also point out, there's a reason that as democracy in ancient Greece arose, kind of the need for political philosophy arose as well, to kind of, as Arendt would say, to think what we are doing and to figure this out, right?
Yeah, well, I like that idea that these two things actually go hand in hand: democracy, which invites every person to have an opinion, right? And then it requires public philosophy. So I think there is a co-relationship. There's something there that these two terms, these two concepts of democracy and philosophy are united. I mean, I think, but democracy is also risky, right? Because when you're inviting everyone to have an opinion, you're inviting them to have bad opinions. I mean, to question the value of democracy. I mean, this is, I say, again, to go back to the idea that, democracy made Plato's anti-democratic musings possible, right? So there's always the risk of self-destruction. But what are you going to do? Life is uncertain.
That's it. What other choices?
We can't freeze things. Too. Entropy is real. So it's just, it's a risk. It's not a risk. Entropy is just a reality.
Yeah, so we have to take that leap of faith because the alternative is to cede power. Right?
My question is for you, as someone with, as the Greek, what did you think about the representation of Greek politics, right? Because in a way, I'm also in the film, Greece plays a big role in both, and especially in the film, I have to really whittle it down to a movie parable, right?
Right. I think you captured it really, really well, and I'm so glad that the bulk of it, you focus a little bit on Syriza and Chypras, but the bulk of it is spent like at the clinic and with the people on the ground and their experience of all the things as they're happening, or even as you mentioned earlier, the professor's own daughter who's talking about political philosophy, and her daughter has to be in Denmark because of the crisis. And that was such a beautiful thing to me. And to show, I think, current Athenians and current Greeks are, and this is another thing in the States that often gets lost, is politics is pervasive. It's not just something that happens on cable news or during when people vote. And for the Greeks, especially amidst all these crises, it's daily struggle, resistance, opening a clinic to serve the people who aren't being served by the government because global capital has just squeezed the life out of the country. It's the Syntagma Square and other squares, the protests. It's the thinking and acting. And so it was really beautiful and touched me so much to see you weave the theory and action through the lives of the actual people, from just doctors to teenagers to professors. So it meant a lot to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 400, the thing is in the film, it's hard to get those facts in, right? Because too many facts would weigh the film down and kill it. So, I get to put the facts in the book, 400,000 young Greeks left after the economic crisis. That's a huge number of people in a country that has 11 million souls in it, right? I mean, so this is massive, immigration. So, these things, but I also was keenly aware of the fact that when it comes to the country's politicians, Greek people are very angry and opinionated. So I felt like, putting any political figures in there was like a major risk. They'd be like, why did you put...
There's an old Greek joke. It goes something like this. What do you get when you put 3 Greeks in a room together? 4 political parties.
Yeah. So I was like, whatever I do, I'm going to make somebody mad here. So I know I was on risky ground.
But it was cool. You had that. Just one last thing. I like how you juxtapose kind of the one Greek that represented maybe the Golden Dawn fear of kind of Muslims overrunning and the refugees overrunning the country, and then juxtaposing that with another Greek who was very welcoming and had philoxenia and is very much saying, well, Greekness isn't so simple anyway. And that was a wonderful thing.
Yeah, that's what happens when you just talk to people in the streets, It's better than Twitter.
I was curious... Did you try to interview Yanis Varoufakis?
I did in the early, in my early sort of casting my net wide, and then we were just never in the same place. He wasn't in Athens when I was there.
I guess
I read all of his books when I was doing the research and thinking about it.
Yeah. I was curious to think, he paints a certain picture of how like why Tsipras went back on all of his promises, and Varoufakis says that basically he was kind of co-opted by Angela Merkel and the Eurocrats, and I'm sure his account is somewhat self-serving, but it does ring basically true, because he was the guy who stuck to his guns, but on the other hand. He was this longtime outsider. He had really very little political experience and was patently terrible at bureaucratic infighting. And I'm just curious. It raises a question of leadership. you have Syriza, which is backed by this like overwhelming democratic, majority, saying, do whatever it takes, just get us out of this stranglehold, and he eventually folds. Varoufakis, for all of his other flaws, he didn't. He stuck to his guns and ended up resigning, right, as finance minister. So, how do you view the problem of leadership in a democracy, and insofar as you have leaders, like how do you kind of ensure, or just think about the question of the leadership doing what they're told, so to speak?
I mean, it's a really tricky question in the Greek context, and it's hotly debated. I mean, I think one interesting thing that I couldn't get in the film, but that's mentioned in the book, is that, I think Tsipras just expected a different outcome from the referendum, right? So when they called the referendum, which is like vote yes or no on the new bailout agreement, I think he expected people to vote yes, because it would have sort of, assuming people that symbolized people sort of staying in the Eurozone and in business as usual, right? So that it would lend legitimacy to him making the choice he ultimately made. So that speaks to this broader trend in Europe we're seeing of leaders calling for votes and then not realizing what's actually going to happen. I mean, that's the Brexit story too, right? Is Cameron saying, okay, we're going to have a referendum, and then look what happened. So I think that's, I think there were people in Syriza who said, well, hold on, if you cannot, if you can't follow the will of the majority, like basically what should happen is like you should resign if you're in a position where you have to violate your principles. Right. And I think it speaks, I think there's all sorts of theories about, well, hold on, what is leadership? Is a leader someone who's like following the call of their conscience and, should stick to their principles no matter what? Or is the leader supposed to be kind of a vessel for the will of the people in whatever direction the people goes in, even if it violates their personal principles? So, I don't have, I don't really have a hard and fast theory around that, in part because I actually did some filming with different political leaders who had really interesting arguments for different kinds of leadership. I do think, on the leadership question, I think the one of the opening quotes from Plato that I put in the film is pretty much right on, right? The price for declining to rule is to be ruled by people lesser than yourself, or whatever it says, right? Yeah, so this is it. I mean, the problem is, if we don't step up and engage in this process of democracy, then we're going to get the leaders we deserve. They're not going to be very good ones. But I think there are lots of people who, looking at the Greek case, basically thought if he's going to have to, rule in a way that's antithetical to everything he stood for, then why does he want that position, right? Why not resign and let someone else do that? But then obviously, he won office again. So Greek people felt that he was better than the alternative in a lot of ways.
Ugh.
Unfortunately, that's the sad reality of the choices available.
Yeah. I mean, my archival researcher for the film, one of my archival researcher worked for his administration pretty high up. And I quote her in the book, and she says, the problem is that we did everything that we were supposed to do as the left, right? We occupied, we rioted, we went on strike, we built a political party. That political party took power, and that's not enough. And so I think for me, what I take away from that whole, story is that we need to think about what the next level is, right? So if a left-wing party taking power in one country isn't enough for them to challenge these bigger forces, then we have to start figuring out how to actually do that old left idea of the international, right? Of building cross-border solidarity. And, and that's a wonderful idea. We don't yet know how to do it in practice, but we have to make it a priority. So, I think there's just a challenge to those of us, especially those of us who want to see left-wing governments win or left candidates win. It's like, it's not that we just need to elect someone we like more and then it's going to be a beautiful new day, right? Because we're up against incredibly strong, organized systems that, it's not like you just get the figurehead that you identify with and then like capital gives you the keys and it says like, have a nice day.
No, that's not how capital acts usually.
There is a thing about that though, like I definitely sympathize with Tsipras and insofar as like Greek is a small and weak country, it's beset by economic crisis, and whenever the government steps out of line, the European Central Bank causes a deliberate bank run in the country to try to just like cudgel the citizenry into line. But on the other hand, you see lefties around the world, who's the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, and various other people saying like, yeah, Bernie, get in there. And I think one reason for that is that, as an American, if you were to be in the position of Syriza at the head of the American state, your power is unimaginably larger. And those mechanisms of capital actually are just the mechanisms of the American state apparatus, which they have sort of colonized over the years. And so you can see why people like that are, because, the president, or, maybe with the backing of Congress, could flip the switches and say capital controls, and we're clamping down on the SWIFT payment transfer system and so on. And, because America is at the apex of this vast system. And, obviously I would not say put all your hopes in Bernie. He'll do everything for you, of course. But the situation of a leftist president of the United States would be a very different situation from tiny little European country.
Well, I think it's interesting. Because if you look at Syriza in Greece in the last 5 years and how different their circumstances were than the Labour Party in the UK in the 40s, right, where there wasn't the problem of capital flight, right? So they could create a welfare state. I think it's a really interesting thought experiment. What could a democratic socialist executive in the U.S. do? Because we would see capital freak the fuck out.
That's right. That's right.
I don't know. Someone tweeted at me the other day. I said something that was, somebody misread or something. They were like, it's Bernie's foreign policy, because I think, he's rightly been coming out strong as an anti-war candidate. And the fact is that American voters are anti-war voters. Trump was an anti-war candidate. Obama was an anti-war candidate, right? They delivered the opposite. And someone, so someone says, well, don't you think Bernie would deliver on this? And I was like, well, he might want to, but we're talking about like huge vested interests in the like military suppliers. We have no idea what the response would be to an anti-war Sanders presidency from those sectors of the economy. So, I'd be happy. I think it would be great to see, but I think we better be ready, because, you would need, again, it's not just, I know we all agree on this, but it's not just the person in office. They have to be backed up by organized people power.
It has to be from the bottom up, as you say, right? Democracy from the bottom up. And we have to call on each other to negotiate our if you go, I love that you put, the Democratic Socialists of America in the same breath as Pericles. But if you've gone to some DSA meetings, you can see some problems, right? But it's true. We have to take that leap of faith and try the best we can from the bottom up to navigate all these things. And I think, it reminded me of your discussion with Wendy Brown. And this might be, for me, the most challenging project that we have to navigate is as she says, supranational forces of global capital as against the demos, which has to be bounded, right, and has to have some type of unity and understand. We have to understand ourselves as some polity, some polis. But that international solidarity that you speak of seems to be the way that we might be able to dismantle global capital. But it's a tremendously daunting thing that maybe we just have to leap into and see what we can do.
I think it is daunting, and that's why, again, we kind of conceptually know the answers. The answer is international solidarity. It's, working across borders when we have common enemies. How we actually do that is very difficult. Even in an age where we have, global communication infrastructure and, all of these obstacles that people were dealing with at the end of the 19th century aren't plaguing us. I mean, I think when we talk about democracy from below, it can sound kind of romantic, right? Oh, democracy from below. It has to be from the bottom up, the grassroots. I have come to the position that it's actually not a romantic thing to say that. It's just politically realistic, right? Yeah. Because we're human beings and we all have to live somewhere. And if we are not powerful in the places we live, right, in our communities, in our workplaces, in our districts, then how the hell are we going to have power at a higher level, right? I mean, there's no skipping this step, right? And so, we might get lucky once in a while and have a party or a person we sympathize with holding power at a higher level. But if we don't have mechanisms by which we can reach them or hold them accountable or exert pressure on the next group, like, we're not going to be able to make any sort of have an impact or make change. So to me, it's like you can't skip the local. It's not some small is beautiful, countercultural localism. It's the fact that we're people, and this is the scale at which we live our lives.
Yeah, that's maybe thinking about this. The individual bottom up sort of thing. One topic I appreciated in the book, which we've discussed on the podcast before, is the idea of sortition. Could you explain how that works? How that worked rather in old Athenian democracy, and why it might be an idea worth dusting off?
Yeah, it's interesting. So sortition, it's a word for it's another word for lottery, right? For selecting representatives as opposed to electing representatives. And so Aristotle was very clear on this, that democracy was not elections, right? So, the elections are our default conception of what a democracy is, right? Okay, we've had elections, so we must be a democracy. To an ancient Athenian, they'd be like, you're crazy. Elections are aristocratic because the rich and the well-born and the well-spoken are going to win. Now we would add the reality TV star to the litany of characters with an advantage. But, so I think that I just love that sort of challenge, right? That we think we know what democracy is, and yet this culture that we attribute the concept to would actually just be totally mortified by our definition. I think that sortition is a very interesting thing for leftists to think about, because what leftists, in my opinion, want to do is figure out how to share power, right? And another way the Greeks put this was to rule and be ruled in turn. And we see all the pathologies of elections. I mean, especially now. I mean, it's like we're living 2020 around the clock. I mean, at least other countries have, parliamentary systems have like short elections. Like, we just live in this perpetual media moneymaker, right? Because it's just like, so I think I'm coming more and more on the side of this of like, let's get rid of elections and just randomly select people just to like save my mental health. But we do have vestiges of the system. We have vestiges of sortition and lottery in the jury system. The idea that we should be able to have a jury of our peers. Scholars, I don't know if these are the people you've spoken to, but there are some scholars. There's a collection out from Verso Books, and they make the case, they're like, well, what sort of system could we imagine where lottery is used? And they say, okay, well, what if one house, the people's house, was selected, and then the other house was elected, right? To sort of reap the benefits of both methods. But I think it actually could be a useful method of bringing people into democratic processes, and is one we're thinking about. I just recently did a film screening with Nancy Fraser, the political philosopher, and she was just like, I hate that idea, because her objection was that she felt that it would eliminate deliberation. In other words, that elections, when we have two candidates vying for office, it creates conditions through which the public deliberates and weighs pros and cons, right? Whereas randomness sort of bypasses that, eliminates the idea of parties. But then, of course, the people selected then have to deliberate, right? To me, it shifts the side of deliberation and then brings all sorts of questions into play, such as like, well, how do you ensure that the citizenry broadly is capable of deliberation if you select them at random? So, I mean, her objection, I think, is worth considering and thinking through. But I do think we need to break the stranglehold of elections on our imaginations. And I think this is why I'm adamant that we have to think democracy not just as a political phenomenon, but as something that has to be expanded into the economic sphere, into the domestic sphere, we have to challenge the sort of sanctimony we have around elections in America right now.
Yeah, it's a way of life, right? Politics is a way of life. You mentioned, I love this etymology of the word idiot in English. It comes from the Greek, right? That means a private person who doesn't understand the role of the citizen to care about the polis and the common good, right? And just cares about his or her own affairs. And there's something in ancient Greece, like sortition selected, but then anyone could just show up and propose a law, right? And everyone felt that their identity was bound up with this active life, which I think capitalism, especially neoliberalism, drains us of energy, time, and builds us, as you say, into consumers, right? Who think that we can just kind of, hashtag resistance, that's the most political that anyone can be, right? Instead of shifting our way of thinking how to be with our families, with our friends, with our communities at all levels, it's a total shift. And so any policy change or change in how we do any procedures would have to be bound up, I think, with these overarching shifts in how we orient ourselves to our communities and to politics.
Yeah, well, and I got into the etymology of the term idiotus, because my gut reaction, as I'm sure many other people's would be, right, to the idea of lottery, of randomly selecting citizens to rule, was, well, hold on, what if an idiot is selected, right? And the point is that our society makes idiots of all of us because we are encouraged to only think about the private and not to think about the public. And to the ancient Greeks, an idiot was someone who only cared about themselves and didn't engage in these collective processes. I mean, I think, there are other things, though. I mean, obviously we live in a far larger society. It's much more complicated. Though I will say, the Athenians were amazingly inventive in terms of making machines out of marble and bronze that would randomly select juries and make sure that they couldn't be corrupted, etc. But there was like a strong religious unity that we don't have in our society. So I think there's still this question. I think the places that I don't go in the film or the book, right, but that are important are sort of like, well, what holds a community together, right? What is... Durkheim wrote about this, right? What is the sacred? What is the solidarity that unites us? And for the Greeks, it was religion. And, for lots of human history, that has been it. I think in our world, it's the market, right? So that even if we don't get along, we can engage in exchange. And so I think there's still this question of like, well, yeah, what is it? What is the bond? I mean, I think sometimes as leftists, we dream like, oh, what can unite us is like, realizing that we have a common enemy, right? The capitalists, the exploiters. But I don't think that's enough to hold us together. Enough. So I think there are questions there that deal with a kind of deeper existential dilemma that I sort of bypass, not to point out my own flaws, but the flaws of my work. But, I think that's something we do have to think about as we try to build unity and build this idea of solidarity that the left dreams of.
The next book, maybe the next film, perhaps, right?
Yeah, I was struck by you interview this a woman, I think must be a college student in South Florida, who goes, she complains, she has like the Fox News brain that, black people are getting all the good welfare. And she goes on, to specifically mention that your parents can only make up to $150,000 or whatever before you are expected to pay everything out of the FAFSA contribution. And it's really, you think about sortition, you're like, oh boy, this person's going to be in Congress or whatever. But on the other hand,
I mean, she basically is.
Yeah.
That's basically who we have in Congress, so that's the problem.
Right. Yeah. Imagine if we had sortition. What if there's a racist dipshit in
my whole
in
class? So I have to say, Ryan, my whole class, every single student, when watching that moment, they cringed and moaned out loud when she was talking, and they were so embarrassed on their own behalf because she's their age, right?
Yeah.
And afterwards, a lot of them were like, I don't know if we can trust democracy. Look at that example. And so I tried to say, well, she's been conditioned in this way. What if she had to actually rule? Like, what if she had to go in there and actually make the laws? Don't you think that would form and shape her in a different way? Would she come out the same way? And one of the students was like, I don't trust it. But I think that's the open question. We take people as static and fixed when we can shape, right, people and how they are.
Yeah, and it maybe raises the possibility of a democratic policy imaginary, for lack of a better word, structuring your policies such that they are very clear and comprehensible. Because what jumps out at this person is that she is been given so much by the government. I would guess her parents are getting huge write-offs from the mortgage interest deduction, lots of other tax benefits, probably investment income, all the, roads, firefighters, police, et cetera, And yet what she sees is the way that when you go to college, the way the policy is explicitly designed is to exclude her, to say, like, you're too rich, you can't do this. Whereas if you were to say, college is free for everyone, and that maybe would inculcate, at least to some degree, a different attitude where you could not possibly deny the fact that the polity, the government was benefiting you, and you couldn't retreat to this like, oh, I made my pile, I didn't have help from anybody.
The city brought you up as Euphemia, is that her name?
The city brought you up, and so I think that is a beautiful connection, right? This idea of when Plato talks about being embedded in the city, right? It is about those structures being visible, and I think you're exactly right. I think as leftists, what we have to do is not just say, oh, the state should provide more, but bring the state. Susan Butler talks about the submerged state, right? All of those invisible forms of welfare and affirmative action that disproportionately white people and wealthy people don't get to. They don't have to think of themselves as receiving benefits, right? Bring those into focus so that they're more legible, and then distribute them in a more egalitarian way, so that we can see that we're none of us are self-made, right? The city's brought all of us up, but I think in my feminist approach to the film, I let some of the bad guys be women, right? There's some very brilliant young women in the film, and there are some very scary young women. And so there's also the young woman earlier in the film who says, I don't care about the word democracy. I just care about the American dream and that ability to climb. Right. So she also doesn't see all of the benefits, all of the structural conditions that have elevated her. Right. So what she's saying basically knowing the larger context of the conversation, what she's essentially saying to me is, I care about capitalism. I don't care about democracy. And I think that's a very interesting thing for us to just be blunt about in this moment, because there is a sort of bifurcation, right? We know this, that, capitalism and democracy are kind of splitting apart, and that post-1989 consensus is fraying, and those of us on the left tend to focus on the renewed interest in democracy, right, and the renewed enthusiasm about socialism. I think we also need to be attentive to the fact that there's a wave of young conservatives who are kind of going back to their conservative roots, right, which is like an explicitly aristocratic, anti-democratic proudly elitist perspective, they're not dressing themselves up in populist rhetoric, right? They have a totally different attitude, which is like, we want what's ours. And we want to fortify our privileges, and we want to do that through the Electoral College, and we want to do that through the Senate, and we want to do that through, voter ID laws and gerrymandering, and it's our right, and we're entitled to, because we are better than everybody else. And that, I think right now in the sort of mainstream conversation about, the political turmoil, there's just, the emphasis on populism is actually like kind of distracting us from this anti-democratic turn on the right. And that's more what I encountered when I went out and interviewed people, right? They weren't saying like, they knew they don't have numbers. These young people, they're like 22 and they know they don't have numbers on their side. They're on a college campus. They know they're loathed by most of their classmates, right? It's in their face every day what a minority they are. And they want a politics of minority rule.
Yeah. Well, we should probably let you go.
Yeah, on that happy note.
Unless you want to talk more, we can always talk more. I don't know how much.
Let the people go home. No.
The book is called "Democracy May Not Exist, But We'll Miss It When It's Gone," and the film is called "What Is Democracy?" Is that right?
Yes, and it's available now on Canopy through most libraries, university libraries, public libraries, and it's also on Amazon and iTunes to rent. Yeah,
and the book is also available, wherever you get your book products. So
absolutely, independent bookstores, highly recommended. I would also highly recommend watching the film and reading the book. They're so complementary, and I really enjoyed both of them together as a distinct experience. So thanks again, Astra Taylor. It's been really wonderful thinking through, as you noted, the risks and pitfalls, as well as the opportunities and possibilities that socialism, democracy, and living well together have for us in the future. So let's do this thing. Let's do it.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.